It's late autumn, somewhere in the rolling hills of the Cherokee homeland. The hunt has been good, better than good. A young hunter returns with a deer slung over his shoulders, its weight heavy but welcome. In the distance, thin trails of hickory smoke curl skyward, carrying with them the rich scent of meat already cooking. And something else, something more enduring. This is not just dinner. This is survival, carefully prepared to last not for days but for months. Long before the whir of refrigerator motors and the hum of electric freezers, the Cherokee people had already mastered the art of keeping meat safe and edible through the leanest months of the year. In the late 1700s and 1800s, across what is now Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, the seasons could be generous or unforgiving. A bountiful hunt in the fall meant nothing if the meat spoiled before winter had even set in. The answer lay in techniques honed over generations, methods that turned fresh venison, bear, or wild turkey into food that could be eaten weeks, even months later. Smoking, drying, storing in rendered fat, combining with berries into energy-rich rations, these weren't just recipes, they were lifelines. Today, we'll step back into that world. We'll follow the hunters, the women tending the fires, and the quiet rhythm of a community turning the day's catch into the next season's sustenance. And along the way, we'll discover that these preservation skills didn't just keep the Cherokee alive. They shaped trade, migration, and survival itself. Imagine the first bite of winter on the air, a faint frost on the grass, breath hanging in front of your face. The hunt is over, but the real work has just begun. The Cherokee often turned to smoke to keep meat from spoiling. The process began with wood. Hickory and oak were favorites, not for their heat, but for their flavor and the way they burned. These hardwoods smoldered slowly, producing a steady stream of fragrant smoke that would penetrate deep into the meat. For small batches, the smoking might happen in the open air, over a low fire shielded by bark panels or hides. But for larger stores, more permanent structures, smoke houses, were built. These were not the tall shingle buildings of later settler farms. Instead, they were often low, enclosed spaces made from logs, wattle and daub, or even carefully stacked stone. Inside, racks or crossbeams were set high above the smoldering embers. The fire was never allowed to blaze. Instead, it burned low and long, sometimes for days, with fresh wood chips added at intervals. The goal was not to cook the meat outright, but to dry it gently while bathing it in preservative compounds from the smoke. Over time, a deep reddish-brown hue would creep across the meat's surface. A leathery outer layer formed, a protective skin against moisture and insects. When done right, smoked venison or bear meat could last many weeks, even in mild weather. And as the winter deepened, the smoky aroma in a Cherokee home was as much a promise as it was a memory of the hunt. But smoke wasn't the only ally. The sun, too, played its role. In the warmer, drier weeks of late autumn, fresh meat was sliced thin, no more than the width of a finger, and laid out to dry in the open air. The thinner the slice, the faster the moisture left it, and the less chance there was for spoilage. Drying racks were built from stripped branches or cane poles, set several feet off the ground to keep scavenging animals at bay. Insect problems were managed with ingenuity. Thin coverings of woven grass mats, loose enough to allow airflow but dense enough to keep flies off, or the strategic placement of green boughs from aromatic plants like cedar, whose scent discouraged pests. The sun's heat, combined with a steady breeze, could transform a slice of venison into something tough but edible in just a few days. Air curing was often paired with a brief smoking at the start or end of the process, lending an extra layer of protection. This dried meat, chewy, concentrated, and almost sweet in flavor, could be eaten as is or rehydrated in stews. It was light to carry, perfect for hunters, traders, or families on the move. And in a time when the nearest store was days away, having several racks of sun-dried venison ready for the taking was a comfort no one underestimated.
Some preservation methods worked best for travel. Others were meant for the home, especially for the long stretch of cold months when hunting might be scarce. One of the most reliable? Storing cooked meat under a thick seal of rendered fat. The process began with a slow cooking. Meat was roasted, boiled, or even lightly smoked until tender. At the same time, chunks of animal fat, often from deer, bear, or sometimes hogs after trade with settlers, were gently melted down over a low fire. This produced a clear, rich liquid called tallow in the case of venison, or lard from hogs. The cooked meat was packed tightly into clay jars, gourds, or sometimes small wooden containers. Then the hot liquid fat was poured over it until every piece was submerged. Once cooled, the fat hardened into a pale, solid seal. Why did this work? Air could not reach the meat. Without oxygen, bacteria struggled to grow, and the protective layer of fat kept moisture and pests out. Properly stored in a cool place, meat preserved this way could last for many weeks, even months. It wasn't just practical, it was rich in calories, something desperately needed in cold weather. On a frigid January morning, cutting through the fat seal to pull out a tender piece of venison was a small luxury that could make the difference between hunger and strength.
Sometimes preservation wasn't only about storing food, it was about creating something portable, nourishing, and ready for the trail. Among the Cherokee, one method echoed what the Plains peoples later called pemmican. Dried meat was pounded into a coarse powder or shredded into fibers. This was mixed with rendered fat until it bound together, then pressed into small cakes or packed into skin bags. But here in the Southeast, there was an added touch. Dried berries, such as service berries, blueberries, or cranberries, were sometimes mixed in. They added not only sweetness, but important nutrients, preventing scurvy on long journeys. The result was dense, durable, and surprisingly tasty. Hunters could carry it for days without fear of spoilage. A single handful could provide enough energy for hours of work or travel. This mixture was more than survival food, it was also a trade item. Small packets could be exchanged with neighboring communities or even with European traders who recognized its value on river expeditions. Of course, preserving the meat was only half the battle. Keeping it safe from animals, insects, and damp was another challenge entirely. Raked racks, sometimes simple wooden frames, other times more elaborate platforms, kept drying or smoked meat out of reach of dogs, raccoons, and other scavengers. The height also allowed breezes to flow through, reducing mold and discouraging flies. For longer storage, covered pits could be used. These were dug into dry ground, lined with bark or grass, and sometimes lightly smoked beforehand to deter pests. The meat, whether dried or packed in fat, was then placed inside and covered with bark, hides, or woven mats. Ash was another tool. Fine wood ash, left from cooking or smoking fires, could be sprinkled lightly over stored meat to deter insects. The taste could be rinsed away later, but it often kept pests from taking hold in the first place. Some households even hung meat directly inside the home's main living space, where the constant presence of a central fire meant the air was warm, dry, and smoky year-round. It wasn't uncommon for visitors to notice cured strips of venison hanging from rafters alongside bundles of herbs and drying corn. These preservation techniques were far more than just food hacks. They were part of a carefully balanced seasonal rhythm. A successful hunt in autumn might mean full racks of meat drying in the sun, jars of venison under fat cooling by the hearth, and baskets of berry-rich trail rations ready for winter journeys. This abundance didn't just feed the family,
It could feed trade. A household with extra preserved meat could exchange it for tools, cloth, or goods brought by traders from hundreds of miles away. And in times of scarcity, whether from failed crops, hard winters, or displacement, these skills could mean the difference between endurance and tragedy. Even into the late 1800s, long after settlers had introduced metal cookware, salt curing, and eventually ice houses, many Cherokee families continued to smoke, dry, and store meat, much as their grandparents had done. The knowledge was practical, proven, and deeply tied to identity.
By the time mechanical refrigeration arrived in rural Appalachia, often not until the early 20th century, these old methods were still quietly at work. In some Cherokee homes, you could still see smoked venison hanging from rafters, or a gourd jar of meat sealed under a layer of fat, sitting cool in a shaded corner. It's easy to forget that survival once depended not just on hunting skill, but on the wisdom of what to do after the hunt. The Cherokee understood that a single deer was not a single meal. It was weeks, even months of nourishment, if treated with care. So the next time you open your freezer, remember, there was a time when winter survival smelled like hickory smoke, tasted like sun-dried venison, and rested in the knowledge passed down through generations.